Hey guys, what's up and welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to be doing something a little bit different just because I feel like I've been kind of in a rut in terms of movies since I'm spending a lot of, essentially all the time at home. I feel like I've run out of things to watch and therefore I thought, okay, let me think about the horror movies that scared me the most and talk about them. That being said, I do want to preface this by saying I am not a movie reviewer, I'm just an average person talking about movies. And when I say horror, I say that very loosely because some of these might be categorized more accurately as thrillers, suspense, psychological horrors. I'm not going to go into the semantics of that. These are just movies that scared me. The horror community scares me a little bit because, like a lot of communities, there's some gatekeeping. I just want to say these are just movies that scared me and that touch on my personal fears. So they by no means are guaranteed to scare you. I'll talk about that more so you can identify what movies are more up your alley and maybe touch on your fears. Anyway, before we get into that, I did want to thank today's sponsor, which is Shudder. Shudder is the Netflix of horror. It has the largest, fastest growing human-curated selection of thrilling and dangerous entertainment filled with supernatural terrors, edge-of-your-seat thrillers, and shocking horrors added each week. You can stream all of the above for $5.99 a month or $56.99 a year, and on all of your favorite devices such as Amazon Fire TV, Roku, Xbox One, iOS, and Android. To try Shudder for free for 30 days, go to shudder.com and use promo code READYTOGLARE. One movie I've mentioned before, and I'll actually be discussing it today, is The Conspiracy. It is by far one of the most suspenseful horror movies that touches on secret societies and their role in our everyday lives. To try Shudder for free for 30 days, go to shudder.com and use promo code READYTOGLARE. Get started streaming the best horror, thriller, and supernatural content. Shudder's expertly curated collection includes must-see titles like The Boy Behind the Door, VHS 94, and PG Psycho Gorman. Plus, all the best horror documentaries and the hit Creepshow TV series from executive producer Greg Nicotero of The Walking Dead. On top of this, Shudder has a new collection featuring old classics from around the world, such as The Wicker Man, Blood on Satan's Claw, and the all-new movie, The Last Thing Mary Saw. Thank you, Shudder, for sponsoring this video. So the first one is the one that I actually mentioned that is on Shudder. That's called The Conspiracy. Now, I'm not going to include any spoilers here, obviously, but I do want to talk about the themes that I find very scary. So first of all, The Conspiracy touches on, I guess, the fear of the unknown, which is a common fear, but more specifically in terms of secret societies, the government, what we're not being told, and the fact that secret societies are operating behind the scenes and essentially kind of changing our lives without us knowing it. And on top of that, there obviously, like the title says, the conspiracy, there's a theme where there's a conspiracy theorist, obviously, in the movie. It forces you to think about the line between a conspiracy theory versus what you actually believe is reality, which I think is a really interesting concept. But I think it can also, on the other hand, be a very scary concept because obviously some realities are hard to digest and scary because they might have more control over you than you think. And that to me is very stressful. On top of this, there are a few scenes where I physically felt myself tense up or where like I held my breath the first time I watched it because I was so stressed out. If psychological horror or thrillers appeal to you, I definitely think this would be down your alley. Next up, we have the Poughkeepsie Tapes. So this movie I actually haven't watched in years due to how much it freaked me the fuck out. And it's actually funny because I watched this movie with my now husband, then we were just still dating. I remember after we watched it together, we couldn't touch each other or like hug each other or anything. We just felt so uncomfortable in our own bodies that we just like sat apart from each other because the movie fucked us up so much mentally that we were just like, I can't, like, I just need to recoil into myself for a moment, which sounds really stupid and dramatic, but truly it is a troubling movie. Now, part of why it's troubling, in my opinion, is the format, because it very much comes off as not necessarily a documentary. I'd say it's like a mixture of, kind of comes off as found footage, but because of how the found footage is shot, let's say, it really is easy to forget that it's a movie and it feels like you're watching something real, which I think is what makes it more disturbing. Like it feels like you might be watching like someone's live stream or someone's home movie as opposed to an actual film, which I think is really great for the suspension of disbelief because you're really immersed in what's happening, which is part of what makes it terrifying because what is happening is psychologically very troubling. This is by far one of those movies that sticks with you after, not necessarily in a good way, in the way that after watching this movie, I just felt so uncomfortable and a little bit paranoid, and it's just quite heavy. So I would say to be very aware of when you watch this movie to go in knowing what you're going into. So watch a trailer, consider how you're feeling mentally and emotionally, because it's just a heavy kind of watch. So it's not just the type of horror that you can shrug off after you watch it. It also has a very traumatizing ending. So it's not one of those movies that gives you a nice feeling of closure at the end, which is another thing that is troubling in a lot of ways. Now, the thing that particularly scared me about this, apart from how it's shot, is that it includes a theme of physical torture. Sure, it's not gory, but there is a lot of psychological torture. There are a lot of images that are really troubling to watch in this movie, and it's not because they're gory or because there's something actually really scary about them. There's just a very big uncanny feeling. And there are a lot of times when I was like scared or uncomfortable and I wasn't really sure why, which I think also scared me because, you know, when you're scared of something, you like to have a name for it. You like to pinpoint it. You like to say, okay, I was scared because of this. With this movie, it's a lot harder because there's some moments where you just feel so uncomfortable, but you're not exactly sure what it is, but something's not right. If psychological horror appeals to you, this is one of those movies that you really, like I said, evaluate how you're feeling before you watch it because it's heavy. Next up, we have The Rental. Now, The Rental is more, I'd say more suspenseful and creepy as opposed to like actively scary. The fear that this movie touches on of mine is that of like home invasion. And that doesn't mean like actual physical home invasion, but your privacy being invaded in your home as well. The idea that inside your home you're not safe, that's a really big fear of mine. So this movie definitely just hit that right on the head because I actually watched this movie when I had recently moved into my new house and we didn't have any of our stuff yet. So we were literally sleeping on a mattress on the floor. And the house was entirely empty aside from that. So we had like no furniture. I think that contributed a great deal to how creepy this movie came off because I became so paranoid after we watched this movie that I literally did not sleep until the sun came up because I was in this empty house and then we watched this movie that touches on one of my biggest fears and it was just a lot. However, this movie is interesting because I feel like there are a lot of different pressure points, and by that I mean there is a theme of romance, but not like in a nice way. It's a theme of, you know, relationships and relationships falling apart or cheating or thinking about cheating. So there's this undercurrent of there's already something wrong before they get to the rental. But then once they are there at this rented house, a lot of other things start happening. So you were already uncomfortable to begin with because there's this tension in the air and you're not really sure what it is. And then on top of that, you then find out this horrible thing that relates to home invasion. And from there, it escalates very quickly into violence and more of a survivor type film. So it really starts as, I think there's an undercurrent of psychological throughout all of it, but I think a lot of it is very much touching on primal fears and touching on physical fears of, you know, the idea of having to run away from someone or the idea of having to fight someone to survive or the idea that you have no way out. And I definitely recommend it because it really, I think, touches on a lot of different fears that people have, which makes it scary on a lot of different levels, in my opinion, or stressful rather. So then we have Creep. Now, Creep, I wouldn't say scares the shit out of me like some of these other movies do, but it is psychologically very unnerving and disturbing, and as you probably noticed, that's a theme here. The psychological is really what tends to scare me the most. Creep is interesting because I think it touches on some societal themes that aren't necessarily tapped into well or often. Internet culture, because this story starts with a Craigslist ad. You know, it kind of makes you analyze how trusting we are of people on the internet. Now, maybe less today than we used to be because this is not like a new movie. So this was quite a few years ago when I think people weren't necessarily as aware of how dangerous the internet is. I've talked about Hinder horror stories here. I've talked about, you know, people from the internet and how people can get away with some really crazy fucked up shit because people are kind of trusting, you know? Like, how many people do you know who just go on a Tinder date without really thinking twice of like, is this safe? Where am I going? Are there gonna be other people? Does someone know where I am? You know, like I know plenty of people who kind of are very blasé about the whole thing and just assume nothing bad's gonna happen. And this film, I think, forces you to think about the possibilities of, oh, I could actually meet someone who's dangerous or a psycho. And I think that's pretty scary. But aside from that, I like that this film is found footage style, which is a common theme in the films that I like. It's just easier for me to be immersed in that. There's the same uncanny, unnerving feeling of something subtle is wrong or something big is wrong, but it's presenting in a subtle way. So you can't put your finger on it, but you feel really uncomfortable. I think pretty much that's how half, if not 75% of the movie is, that you just can't really figure out what exactly is wrong, but you can tell that something is, which really builds up a lot of suspense, which is great. And then when things come to light, that's when you're like, oh, okay, this was worse than I thought. The buildup is excellent. I really loved that about Creep. Aside from that, the ending is, I wouldn't say predictable in a bad way, but predictable because the buildup is so intense that you're like, this can only end in X way, and it does. This one is a bit heavy, but it's not as bad as the Poughkeepsie Tapes. This one I think is easier to shrug off, so it's not the thing that'll keep you awake in the middle of the night. Well, it might. There's some parts of it that might keep you up in the middle of the night, actually. Last of all, we have Goodnight Mommy. Now, this one is very atmospheric. I'd say that in comparison to all these other movies, it's far more aesthetic in the sense of it feels more like art than a movie, if that makes sense. Not in a pretentious or bad way, but there's a lot that is left unsaid, whereas the other movies I feel like follow a more typical trajectory. This movie is by far the most psychological in the sense of you begin to question what is reality and what is imagined in the movie. So immediately you get this layer of confusion, not in a negative way, but in the way where you're not really sure what's happening because there is so much blurred between this is real and this isn't. Aside from that, this is also a movie about a family that breaks up. Family movies, for some reason, creep me out. Like family horrors, just there's something about them, especially when there's children involved. And here there are two children involved. I'd say there's also the theme of kind of a body snatcher theme in a certain way, if you want to say it that way, or of an imposter, which I think is interesting because since it's a family movie, I'm not going to get into detail, obviously, but imagining someone in your family isn't who they say they are, or someone's pretending to be part of your family, or anything of the like, is very stressful, like being in the house with someone that you think isn't who they say they are or something along those lines. I find that very stressful, which is also what made this movie so scary. The storyline of this movie isn't entirely clear until the very end when things start to make sense because you've seen everything that's occurred and then you can add 1 + 1 and get to your conclusion. I think that makes you stay invested in the movie. I also find that I felt physically uncomfortable watching it, and I don't know if it's just because children involved with like evil makes me really uneasy, but it's also one of those movies that I would consider more heavy. It's not an easy watch by any means in the sense of there are some of these movies like The Conspiracy and Creep, I can watch those easily without having to really think about, am I in the right mental state? The other movies can actually cause me to go into panic or get anxiety or have difficulty just shaking them off after. So this is one of those movies that I don't really think you can shake off that easily. So I would suggest considering your mental state before. Anyways, these are the movies I thought of. You guys can let me know if there are movies you guys recommend, especially if it's found footage. Please let me know in the comments down below because I'm dying. I've watched some of the worst movies. You know it's bad when you get to Sharknado and you're just like, fine, I'll watch this, I guess. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you to my patrons as always, and I'll catch you guys next time.